You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Joshua Hendrickson of the University of Mississippi. Josh, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you for having me.
So our topic for today is a paper Josh has written entitled U.S. Maritime Policy and Economic Efficiency. It deals with the controversial Jones Act that governs American overseas shipping. So to get into the discussion, Josh, how about you walk me through what is U.S. maritime policy? What's the set of policies that you're analyzing in this paper?
Well, I guess originally it kind of started because I was just interested in the Jones Act. 'Cause so many people talk about how costly the Jones Act seems to be, and it's this law that's been around for 100 years, and everyone talks about how it's so costly, and economists sort of universally seem to think we should get rid of it, but yet it's lasted this long, and so I kind of wanted to dig into it, and in digging into it, I essentially found that it's part of like a much broader sort of policy that the United States has had essentially since its founding, dedicated to how to treat shipping and shipbuilders and the merchant marine and things of that nature.
Yeah. And so just to be clear on what the Jones Act does, if I'm recalling correctly, it says that a ship going from one U.S. port to another U.S. port has to be a U.S. ship, so you can't register your ship out of some other country and then do shipping between Puerto Rico and Miami, for instance.
Right. So it has to be a U.S. flagged ship. It has to be U.S. owned, and so I guess maybe it would help to kind of give some background as to sort of what I kind of argue in the paper and kind of some historical background to the policies, I guess. So overall, when we're talking about maritime policy, there's this sort of fundamental problem, I guess, that every country faces, and that is, there's a possibility that you go to war, and if you go to war, you might need to use a navy when you're at war, depending on the nature of the war. But also at the same time, other countries might go to war, and so during wartime, this might affect your ability to actually conduct international trade. So the reason for this is that typically during peacetime, a navy is not going to operate with the same capacity that they would operate during a war. And so what that has typically meant throughout naval history is that kind of what happens is that when wars occur, private ships are often used, whether they're seized or whether they're compensated or whatever, sort of depends on the historical era and the country that we're talking about and things like that. But these private ships tend to be used to kind of assist the Navy. So they essentially provide sea lift for the Navy during wartime. And so this creates a whole set of problems. So first of all, you're only going to, if we take this from the perspective of the United States, from the United States perspective, if the United States goes to war, they're only going to have these private ships available if there are sort of U.S. ships that are used in trade already, right, for them to use. But also at the same time, even if the United States doesn't go to war, other countries might go to war and they might use the private ships that fly their flag in the same way. And so if they do that, then this can potentially impair international trade, because now if, say a British flagged ship was carrying cargo from the United States to somewhere else or from somewhere else to the United States, and the British go to war, then that ship might not be carrying cargo for trade. It might be carrying cargo for the British Navy. So there's a whole host of issues here that have to be tackled as kind of, if you're the government and you're trying to figure out how to navigate these problems, you have to think carefully about what you want during peacetime and what you want during wartime. And so the sort of general pattern is that essentially you want to have a merchant marine that is engaged in private shipping during peacetime that is available to use for naval purposes during wartime. Of course, there's this other issue that these private shipping companies are not going to want to necessarily divert their resources towards, fighting a war or what have you. So they're going to have to be compensated for this. And so I guess really what my paper gets at is how do you construct compensation for this sort of thing? And what I argue is that there's kind of like this Coasian bargain here where the state needs to be able to tap into the supply of these ships, and not only the ships, but their crews, and for use during wartime and other sort of national emergencies. And so there's a potential gain from trade here. So the government could just purchase these services. But at the same time, there are challenges here. So, first of all, if you're going to do something like this, you're going to need these ships to fly your flag. You're going to need them to be owned by people within your country. You're going to need to have crews on these ships that are sort of citizens of your country, so that they're willing to actually provide this service. But then they're also going to need compensation. But also the problem with compensation is if you wait for a war to occur and then you try to offer compensation, then there might be this holdup problem where these private companies know that the government needs these ships and in order to fight the war, and they know that the government might have a higher willingness to pay during wartime than what market prices would dictate. And so they might be able to extract some of that. So from the perspective of the government, what I argue is that essentially the kind of Coasian bargain is that the government kind of pays, they kind of give subsidies or payments to shipbuilders, to the merchant marine, and people like that during peacetime, with the understanding that during wartime, these ships are going to be diverted for military use.
Mm-hmm. And it might not be, once war breaks out, they might not be asking or negotiating over price. That at that point, the deal has already been made.
Correct. Yeah. So, I mean, this issue has come up sort of throughout U.S. history because, like there's an issue of, executive authority and, can the sort of commander in chief during wartime just kind of requisition the ships, in which case, people flying U.S. ships would have no choice. But of course, if you know that that is possible, then that just makes you less likely to fly the U.S. flag in the first place, which makes this sort of bargain necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it makes some intuitive sense. Many ships are registered out of small countries like what is it, Panama? A lot of ships are registered out of Panama just for tax reasons. But if if a war breaks out, the U.S. government can't seize a ship registered out of Panama because that's an active war against Panama then, and suddenly it becomes much more complex. So it so this idea of making sure that there are lots and lots of ships on the sea flying the American flag and under U.S. jurisdiction, while it during peacetime seems a little silly, and arbitrary, it does make some sense. And yeah, and so these policies, the Jones Act, they come out of the end of World War One. Were people at the time using, can you tell me a little bit about the background here? Like, why were these policies passed? Were the justifications used at the time similar to the ones you're using now?
Yeah, so I guess what I found is that when I started to look back at U.S. history to see whether the sorts of bargains that I'm describing have existed, for a long time, or if they originated with the Jones Act or what have you. When you go back through U.S. history, essentially what you find is that there's a consistent pattern of the U.S. government trying to make sure that they have a sufficient merchant marine that they can tap into during times of war, and they try to make sure that they have that sufficient merchant marine at all times. The problem that they face is that if you think about over the course of U.S. history, there are a variety of sort of exogenous shocks that occur. So there's lots of changes in terms of what a ship actually is. So if you think about ships during like the Revolutionary War, you're talking about like wooden ships, whereas if we think of ships today, they're predominantly like large steel ships. And so there's issues like that. But then there's also issues in terms of, foreign conflicts and things like that. So, but there's this consistent pattern. So, I mean, for example, after the founding of the United States, sort of one of the first acts of Congress created kind of different tariffs on foreign and domestic ships. So, in fact, there was like a tiered system. So, the highest tariffs were paid by foreign ships. And then, if you had a U.S. flagged ship that was produced in a foreign country, you paid a lower tariff. And if you had a ship that was produced in the United States and flew the U.S. flag, then that would get an even lower tariff. And so you had this kind of tier system. And the idea was that this would reward companies for building ships in the United States and for flying the U.S. flag, because that would, create a sort of merchant marine that they could tap into during times of war. Even the Jones Act itself is actually, so when we say that the Jones Act is 100 years old, the Jones Act is really kind of a clarification of an earlier law. So actually, this idea that you can only transport cargo between two U.S. ports with a U.S. flagged ship is actually dates back to 1817. The Jones Act really just clarified what that actually means. So what does it mean? So, for example, it has to be a U.S. flagship and it has to be U.S. owned. And so there's a question of, well, what does it mean to be U.S. owned? So if the company that owns the ship is, 60% owned by Americans, is that considered U.S. owned, or, does it have to be higher than that, or is it just greater than 50%, or like what's the restriction? So the Jones Act really just kind of tried to clarify those things. The other thing that the Jones Act clarified is that there were court challenges to this earlier law for, essentially a century, where people would ask, what is really like U.S. port to port shipping? So if I leave Miami, let's say, and then I stop off in a foreign country, and then I circle back and I come back to Boston or something like that, is that U.S. port to port shipping? So if the cargo was loaded in Miami and for Boston, but I make a pit stop in a foreign country, is that still U.S. port to port shipping? And these sorts of things were subjected to a lot of legal action. And so because of that, the Jones Act really just kind of clarifies what this earlier law meant. But these kind of laws are kind of consistent. And essentially what happens is, as challenges occur and as sort of you get these productivity shocks in the shipping industry, they kind of have to adjust policy accordingly. And so those early U.S. policies actually created a really strong merchant marine. And the U.S. Had a really strong merchant marine until about the Civil War. But during the Civil War, the Union wasn't really. It's kind of unclear when you kind of read the history of this, but they were either unable or unwilling to protect the merchant marine during the war, and so a lot of U.S. flagships switched flags. And then after the war, they were kind of punished for switching flags by the U.S. government, essentially saying, well, if you switch flags, you can't switch back, which did a lot of damage to the merchant marine. And also, as there was this kind of shift towards using steel ships, the U.S. had wooden ships, and not only they had wooden ships, but they tended to have like the fastest wooden ships. And so there was this hesitancy to kind of switch. And so the real impetus for changing happens sort of at the turn of the 20th century, because the U.S. gets involved in the Spanish-American War, and they realize that they don't have an adequate merchant marine to tap into. Also, the Boer War between Britain and South Africa breaks out, and the British divert a bunch of ships that were typically delivering cargo to the United States, and so or picking up cargo from ports in the United States, and so you just have cargo just piling up at U.S. ports because there's nobody to actually ship it because the merchant marine wasn't large enough to handle it.
That's
And
interesting.
so,
So
yeah,
a totally unrelated war, fought, by a different country, could severely disrupt American shipping. That's a really sort of interesting problem, and
correct.
I
Yeah.
can see why they were eager to find solutions for that.
Yeah. And in fact, it's really interesting because even people like Thomas Jefferson were writing about this at the kind of founding of the United States. They were talking about how it was really important to have this merchant marine. And what they were worried about is, I mean, I don't think many people appreciate this, but if you think about back around the founding of the United States, the recent history was most countries were at war most of the time. And so this concern was sort of front and center on people's minds. And Thomas Jefferson sort of brought this up repeatedly and was kind of an advocate for these early policies, despite, elsewhere sort of advocating free trade and things like that. He was a strong advocate for these policies because essentially what he argued is, look, these other countries might go to war. And if they go to war, they're going to divert their ships. And then we're not going to have anybody to carry our cargo. And so what are we going to do then? Well, we need to have our own sort of industry that can carry that. And also, in the event that we go to war, we can tap into those ships in the same way that these other countries have done.
Yeah, and your paper also includes a quote from Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, speaking positively about the active navigation, which in English law with I assume a similar effect.
Yes, correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think the biggest difference was in the early 20th century, the Jones Act kind of comes along and it clarifies a lot of these rules that had actually been in place for a century already. But then kind of what happens is maritime policy actually becomes sort of much more explicit. So like in the early 20th century, the U.S. government really tries to experiment with a bunch of different ways to revitalize the merchant marine. And so during World War I, Woodrow Wilson realizes that, again, that they have sort of inadequate capacity. And so they have this massive program to build ships in the run up to World War I. But as part of this kind of policy, they were required to sell all the ships that were kind of built. And the idea was to kind of create a merchant marine. So what we're going to do is we're going to have shipbuilders build a bunch of ships. The U.S. government's going to buy them. They're going to use them for naval purposes. And then when the war is over, we're going to sell them. And so then private companies are going to buy these things. They're going to convert them for use in international trade and things like that. And so now we'll have this strong merchant marine because they're going to be able to buy these ships that were built. And so that will kind of restore things. The problem is that didn't really work. And so you get lots of other subsequent experiments. So like in the late 1920s, you get the Merchant Marine Act of 1928, and what they do there is they try to promote a strong merchant marine by giving mail subsidies to ships. So you need the mail to be carried to places outside of the sort of lower 48 states of the United States. And so what do you do when you need mail to go overseas? Is, well, you got to carry it on a ship. And so they thought, well, we'll give mail subsidies. And those mail subsidies will encourage more people to get into shipping. And in doing so, it'll promote the merchant marine. And the problem is that these mail subsidies just became like giveaways and were just, there was a huge controversy because of the level of corruption in giving out these subsidies. And so when Roosevelt comes to power just a few years later, he essentially comes to power and he advocates getting rid of these mail subsidies, but he also says, look, from our nation's founding, we've kind of given indirect subsidies, right? So you think the Jones Act is like an indirect subsidy. It's protecting U.S. ships from foreign competition for port-to-port shipping. And what Roosevelt says is, look, we've been doing all kinds of implicit subsidies for, domestic shipping and for international shipping. And instead of doing things that way, let's just be explicit. Let's just explain to the public that that we need these subsidies for the merchant marine, and we're just going to be explicit about what we're doing. We're paying them so that we can have this strong merchant marine, and so that we can use them during wartime. And so the legislation that's passed in the 30s explicitly, mentions this motivation. It explicitly says, look, we need increased naval capacity during times of war and emergencies, and that's what these subsidies are for. But Roosevelt's subsidies were kind of operating differential subsidies. So what they were designed to do was compare the cost of U.S. ships to foreign ships, and then the government would kind of subsidize the difference. So essentially what they were trying to do is cover the cost differential so that firms could charge the same sorts of prices that these foreign flagged ships were charging. But I mean, this continues all the way through the 20th century. So, I mean, Roosevelt does this. Then during the Vietnam War, Nixon has a big push towards revitalizing the merchant marine and encouraging shipbuilding. In the 1990s, the subsidies put in place by Roosevelt are replaced. And instead of giving subsidies based on operating costs, the subsidies changed to just lump sum payments, and it's made explicit what these lump sum payments are for. So essentially what they argue is that we're going to give you this lump sum payment every year, and in exchange for that lump sum payment, if we go to war or if there's a national emergency, we're going to take these ships and we're going to use the ships and the crew to, for naval purposes or for carrying supplies or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that seems like the most sort of direct and efficient way of achieving a goal. As economists are very boring, and often their proposals for sort of complicated policies to achieve a certain goal, and the answer so often is just pay people for exactly the thing you want.
And I think that sort of that arrangement kind of makes explicit what I was trying to argue at the beginning, that, the government needs a service. There are companies out there who are capable of providing this service. And so, any economist would recognize that the government should just pay them for this service. The difference is that this tends to occur, until the 1990s, this kind of occurred in sort of roundabout ways. So instead of just coming out and saying, look, we're paying you to do this, they would just kind of create, creative solutions that they thought would, produce the same sort of result. But also, a lot of the changes in policies also just have to do with, as I said, changes in technology and changes in circumstance. So, other countries go to war, and all of a sudden you realize that the merchant marine isn't as strong as you need it to be. But also, like as you mentioned, flying Panama's flag, there's a reason why people do that. Panama's flag is what's often referred to as like a flag of convenience. So there are certain countries that essentially allow you to fly their flag, and in doing so, you're not subject to any kind of like labor market regulations, or you're not subject to paying income taxes and things like that. And so if you fly a flag of convenience, it significantly reduces the cost of operating the ship. And this has been a challenge to a lot of developed countries throughout the world, is that what do you do? Because developed countries are trying to maintain their merchant marine. It's not just the United States, but they are developed countries, and so they are paying their workers much higher wages than workers in developing countries are willing to work for. And kind of what you need out of the merchant marine is you need not only the ships, but you need the crews. Because like if you have a foreign crew on your U.S. flagged ship, there's a good chance that when the United States government comes along and says, well, we're going to war, we're taking your ship and your crew, that the crew just abandons ship, right? Like if you're not from the United States, you're not necessarily going to feel the same obligation to serve in that role as as a foreign citizen or something like that. And so these developed countries have faced a real challenge with these flags of convenience, and that's, I think, part of the reason why some of these subsidies have become more explicit, but also why people have experimented with other kinds of policies. So these flags of convenience create an issue in the sense that they allow ships to avoid a lot of the costs associated with operating in a developed country. And so some countries have tried to encourage their own merchant marine by sort of experimenting with other policies. So, for example, like Norway and Denmark and Germany have, for example, created separate registries that ships engaged in international shipping can register on, and those registries provide them with more favorable terms. And the idea is that this is a way for these developed countries to compete with the countries that are allowing ships to fly their flag with little taxation and little regulation and things like that.
Mm. So to be clear, so there are two different. If you're a ship shipping into or out of Denmark, or I guess between Danish ports, that's a short route. You can register in one of two ways, and one of them has you subject to less strict taxation or regulation.
Yes, essentially, yeah. So it's kind of like a way to try to compete with these flags of convenience.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I kind of wanted to mention is there's always a potential issue with this kind of an argument. And so what I mean by that is that my argument that we should observe these bargains between the government and the merchant marine, these arguments and the historical narrative kind of fit together really well. But there's also this issue of, well, is this kind of like a just so story? So are we just kind of, fitting some kind of economic theory to the narrative rather than using economic theory to explain what's actually happened and what's occurred? But I think that we can find evidence that this argument kind of broadly applies to all kinds of transportation. And so in my paper, I mentioned a couple of different examples of this. And the US has had other policies designed to subsidize transportation that they would tap into during wartime. So one example is the creation of a remount system prior to World War I. So the United States, so in other words, as of World War I, horses were still being used frequently in war to carry supplies and soldiers and things like that. And there was an issue that during the Boer War, the British didn't have enough horses for the war. And so what they were doing is they were just going around and buying horses from everywhere, and including the United States. And so in the early 20th century, there was a shortage of horses that could be used for military purposes in the United States. And most of the horses that were being used on farms were not well equipped to serve in a military capacity. And so the United States created a sort of remount system where they subsidized horse breeding, and they created these remount depots to kind of train these horses for these kinds of jobs and things like that. And the idea is that unlike other things like ships, where maybe if you just through learning by doing, if you just build a lot of ships, you can start to build the ships and you can build them faster and faster, and you can get them to market quicker. So if you go to war, not having the ships is a problem. But you can potentially control the amount of time it takes to get the ship built by how much, by sort of how much of your resources you want to devote towards building ships. But with horses, the time to build is kind of determined by nature. So there's not really anything that you can do. And so the fear is that if a war came, the United States wouldn't have a sufficient supply of horses. And so they needed to start breeding them. And so that remount system did that by subsidizing horse breeding so that they would have these horses that they could use in the event of war. And then also, a similar sort of system exists for aviation. So if you think about, the merchant marine providing sea lift during wartime, you might say, well, why not just use planes? And the United States has actually done this. So during World War II and during the Korean War, there were planes that essentially just got requisitioned by the U.S. government to use in those wars. And then afterwards, they realized that they needed some kind of formal program to do this in the future. And so they created the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. And essentially what it does is it asks domestic airlines in the United States if they want to participate in the program. And if they sign up for the program, the United States government agrees to reimburse them for any costs that are incurred during wartime for diverting their planes for use in the war. And also it provides them with contracts where they will use these domestic airlines to ship things. So essentially they're kind of subsidizing these domestic airlines by using them for government purposes during peacetime. And then with the understanding that if you participate in this program, the government might come and take your plane during wartime. So there seems to be this seems to be kind of a general transportation policy that goes on here. It's not just with shipping. It seems to be a kind of system that exists for any kind of assistance that the government might need during these emergencies.
Yeah. And you could analogize, other things, other policies meant to deal with some infrequent crisis. Although I really, at this point, the United States has been in wars in the Middle East for my entire adult life, so I guess it's not as infrequent as maybe I'm implying there, but something like food security, right? People justify farm subsidies on the basis that you could have a situation where it becomes hard to trade with other countries for food for one reason or another, and then it's good to have domestic farming. I'd argue that only really applies to staple crops, but that there are these policies that they're not meant to be efficient in like the short term or on a regular day or during normal times. But then, there's some kind of low probability catastrophic event that they're meant to deal with, and they can be hard to evaluate.
Yeah, I guess the way that one of the ways that I talk about it in the paper is I say that we could construct a model of like optimal tax policy based on sort of who is producing things that might be of value, that might be like sort of complementary towards providing national defense or something like that. And so in a broad sense, what that's essentially arguing is that the sorts of things that are going to be complementary to defense, you can construct an optimal tax policy in which those kinds of industries or those kinds of goods are subject to lower taxes than other industries that aren't necessarily providing any sort of complementarity towards national defense. Now, how broad we want to take that argument, I don't know. But I guess what my perspective on this is that I got into thinking about this because of these arguments about the Jones Act and because of these arguments that things like the Jones Act were so extremely costly And I am not going to argue that the Jones Act is like optimal policy. But I do think that when you hear these cost estimates, if you accept my sort of argument here that there is kind of this need for the government during times of war for these ships and for these crews and things like that, and that they're going to provide compensation during peacetime in exchange for taking these ships and these crews during wartime for their own purposes. If you're going to accept that kind of argument, then that argument has to be taken into account when you're talking about the cost of these programs, right? So when we think about it, when we think about cost as economists, we think about, the cost relative to the counterfactual. And so a lot of what you hear about the Jones Act and in terms of like what the Jones Act would cost, and how much we could save if we would get rid of it, they're sort of adding up these costs. And some of those costs, might actually be cost savings, but some of those costs are not going to be avoidable because if they were to get rid of the Jones Act, they would replace it with some other policy that tries to achieve the same objective. And so in my paper, one of the things that I kind of looked at was, how much would it save, to get rid of the Jones Act and things like that. And you hear examples that essentially say, look, this would cut shipping costs like in half, maybe even more, if we would just get rid of it. The problem is that what people are doing when they talk about those costs is they're just comparing the cost of like a U.S. operated ship to the cost of like a foreign flagged ship. And the problem with doing that is that, first of all, when it comes to U.S. port to port shipping, this is considered domestic production. So in order to work on a ship that's going to engage in port to port shipping, you have to be a U.S. citizen by U.S. law. So foreign workers, even if we said, okay, we'll get rid of this U.S. flag restriction, the foreign ships would have to employ U.S. crews. But this is like a big deal. And it's a big deal because of the cost differential between U.S. flag ships and foreign flag ships. About 88% of that cost differential is explained by labor costs.
To be clear, do you just need permission to work in the United States? So if you had a green card, could you work on this, or is it really a requirement of citizenship?
So as I understand it, there is no visa that you can obtain that would allow you to work on one of these ships because it's considered domestic production. Now, of course, we could always, I guess if you want to get rid of this law, one of the things you could always argue is, well, let's also just get rid of that. We can change immigration law. So we can just say, well, this is a special type of production and it shouldn't be governed by, the same sorts of laws that we use for other things. And so, let's just allow foreign workers to work on these ships. And I think that you could do that, but even if you did that, you could only do it to some degree. Because remember, one of the things that the government is going to want to have is they're going to want to have U.S. crews on these ships because they need those crews to serve in a naval capacity in the event of a war. And foreign workers are unlikely to want to sign up for that kind of an obligation. And so historically, there have been, rules that have been put in place, to have a certain percentage of a ship's crew, that's U.S. citizens and things like that. And so it's very likely that even if you fixed immigration law, that you would still end up having predominantly U.S. crews. And like I said, the reason that's important is that like 88% of the cost differential between U.S. and foreign ships is labor costs. And so if we're changing the flag on the ship or we're changing the owner of the ship, but the labor that's used on the ship isn't changing, then there's not a lot of cost savings that's going to be had. And so I think that a lot of the costs of the act are overblown because it's not using the right counterfactual, right? The proper counterfactual is going to take into account that, the government is going to want to have some kind of subsidy in place, that the government is going to try to ensure that, these are predominantly U.S. crewed ships. right? Those are things that we would expect to happen. And so if you incorporate that into the counterfactual, then a lot of these cost savings start to disappear. And, it's not to say that there's no cost savings there, because like I said, I don't think that this is an optimal policy. I think it's, kind of second best policy. But that doesn't mean that, but, saying that it's not the best policy doesn't mean that there's a significant cost savings. And so once you take into account labor costs and the likelihood that those labor costs are not going to be able to be avoided, a lot of the cost savings disappear. Now, what I will say is, like, there are issues in maritime policy that I think need to be addressed and that represent challenges going forward. So I don't want to spend too much time defending the Jones Act because there are problems with that, but there's also problems with other policies. I think that my theory kind of does a good job of explaining the motivation behind what the U.S. government has done since its founding. But the U.S. government has really struggled to achieve the objectives set out by that argument. And I think that part of the reason is these technological changes that happen over time. Some of these are just sort of exogenous shocks that come from, other countries going to war and things like that. And some of these are, some of their inability to achieve these objectives is just coming up with a lot of, shall we say, less than transparent ways of subsidizing the merchant marine and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the sort of maritime security program that they have in place for international ships kind of comes the closest to what my model kind of suggests is the kind of optimal strategy. The Jones Act doesn't, but I still think that the costs are sort of overinflated. But I guess what I would say is there are still challenges, and I think that people would be better focused on thinking about how to face those challenges. So, for example, one of the issues is that, my entire argument is predicated on these ships being, complementary to the Navy. But this is not as much the case as it has been in the past. So, for example, there has been a sort of containerization of shipping that has taken place. So, you have a lot of container ships. And so, cargo is loaded into containers. Those containers are stacked on the ship. They pull into a port. There's machinery there to unload the containers off of the ships and things like that. And this has been a huge productivity improvement for shipping. It's also not very complementary towards what the U.S. Navy would need. So the U.S. Navy would prefer to use things like roll-on, roll-off ships. So prior to containerization, people used a lot more of these roll-on, roll-off ships where you're able to basically, as it suggests, you roll on and roll off the cargo. And the reason that this is important is that if you think about the Navy, and the Navy is going to use a particular ship, a container ship is not going to be as useful as the roll-on, roll-off ship, because to use a container ship, you have to be pulling the ship into a port where the infrastructure is in place to unload the containers. And so typically, if we're talking about a war, you're not going to have the kind of infrastructure in place at the port where you show up to kind of unload your cargo that you would have for a container ship. And so, like, roll-on, roll-off ships are much more useful for military purposes, but they're also becoming less frequently used by U.S. flagged ships. And so what that means is that, maybe these subsidy policies need to be changed in some way. So I referred to like the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. What they do is they have a point system to domestic airlines where the domestic airlines pledge to use certain planes for military purposes when they participate in that program. But what happens is, like, the Air Force looks at the planes and they assess the planes, and then based on how complementary those planes are for their purposes, they assign points to that company. And then the points determine the size of the subsidies that these airlines get. I think that in the U.S. they are going to have to do something similar when it comes to shipping, because these roll-on, roll-off ships are very valuable for naval purposes, but the container ships are not as valuable. And so there's no reason why they should get the same level of subsidy. The other thing is that there's one thing about the Jones Act where I think that even though I'm skeptical of some of these cost savings, there's one thing that I agree with for people who critique it. And that one element is there's a domestic build requirement. So these have to be U.S. flagged ships and U.S. owned ships, but they also have to be U.S. built ships. And part of the problem here is that this is an indirect subsidy to shipbuilders, but by protecting these shipbuilders from competition, what it really does is it prevents innovations in shipbuilding in the United States. And the Jones Act ships have no choice but to go to these shipbuilders to build the ships. And so, that's one instance where this indirect subsidy is working in the opposite way of what it's intended to do. So I think that, there are challenges here and there are things that need to be changed. But I think when we look over the course of the history of maritime policy, I think we see a broadly consistent pattern of trying to construct this bargain between the merchant marine and the U.S. government so that they have this ability to use these ships and use these crews during times of war and national emergencies. And however clumsily the United States has tried to achieve these goals, I think there's no doubt that that's what these things were intended to do.
Yeah. So it's interesting that, to sort of summarize this conversation, it's not that, maybe before I would have said the Jones Act and similar policies are just inefficient. They should just be, repealed completely. Now I would have a different view, which is not that the Jones Act is great policy in its current form, but just that, any kind of repeal to it, any kind of change to it should take into account this need for a merchant marine and should be very explicitly and targeted at the maintenance of a merchant marine, not just we need more ships, but we need more ships specifically of the type, and having the qualities that can be useful in a future, in a crisis. And so, your giant container ship full of iPhones, if the US gets into a war with some country, they're not going to be loading that up with supplies and then trying to quickly construct a port capable of unloading that ship. So it shouldn't have a subsidy. But yeah, it kind of has me thinking about this policy in a new light. Do you have any concluding thoughts for someone who has listened to this whole conversation and is what's the general takeaway that someone should come away with it from?
I guess my perspective on this is that as economists, we tend to look at things very narrowly, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't also have that bias. But we tend to look at things kind of narrowly. And I think one of the things that kind of exploring this topic has taught me is that it's kind of important to dig into the details and also to try to think of what the objectives are and what is trying to be, what people are trying to achieve with these policies. And that's not to say that if, that all the policies that we complain about all the time are actually good if we just dig in or something like that. But I mean, I think that in some cases, there are things that we just don't understand very well. And I feel like working on this, I've learned a lot more about U.S. maritime policy than I would ever thought that I would know. And it's very much changed the way that I think about these issues. And it's also important because I think economists need to be more engaged in these kinds of conversations, because if they're going to construct these sorts of policies, we should want these policies to achieve their goal, and to do so in a way that's straightforward and that's not going to always rely on sort of second best policies or sort of weird kind of rules or things like that to try to create particular outcomes. I think economists have a role to play here. And I think that, what got me interested in this was I remember listening to a podcast on NPR where they said, oh, we couldn't find a single economist who could explain why the Jones Act even exists. And so when I listened to that, I kind of just thought to myself, well, challenge accepted. I want to go figure out what's going on here. And I think that economists have an important role to play here. And I think we need to do a much better job of sort of thinking through like what is trying to be achieved with policy, whether policy achieves those goals, how policy could be improved, and also, bearing in mind that we always need to think about the proper counterfactual, because a lot of the arguments against these policies have kind of assumed that, well, we can just repeal them and with no subsequent action. And the history of these policies suggests that that's not the case. And so we need to think carefully about what role we can play and how we can better understand these things. And I think also what this has taught me is, it's gotten me back to what really got me interested in economics. Is I got into economics because I thought that economics provided me the tools to better understand the world. And I think too often we as economists get into this mode where we want to look at things and provide policy advice to change the world for the better. And I think sometimes we need to be a little bit more humble and just try to understand the world, because if you try to understand it, then sometimes you stumble upon something like this, or something that seems costly and weird actually seems to have a really important purpose. And so much so that, the government has been pursuing these sorts of policies for over 200 years.
Mm-hmm. It's a sobering thought. My guest today has been Joshua Hendrickson. Josh, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, listeners. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Economics Detective Radio. If you want to make a small donation to the show, you can pledge a few dollars per episode at patreon.com. And if you want to discuss this or any topic related to economics, you can join the Facebook group. That's Economics Detective on Facebook. I realize I haven't been releasing episodes quite as frequently lately. I've been hard at work finishing my dissertation and just had a string of bad luck emailing potential guests and having them all be too busy. So, sometimes you just, can't do as much as you want to. But hopefully we'll have some new episodes coming soon, and I'll be able to pick up a more frequent release schedule once the dissertation is all done. We'll see about that. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back soon.